let's move into our service and just take a moment to give thanks for being here this afternoon. We've got a gorgeous sunny day down in here in North Devon. I hope you've got some sunshine and some warmth where you are. We've been waiting for this, and it's really delicious to enjoy. The theme this month is the simple life that Steve will be leading us through when we come to that part of the program. But for the moment, we're going to move into lighting our candle. And if you have a candle at home that you would like to light, I have a candle, but because we're not in our own accommodation, we can't actually light it here this afternoon. But I do invite you to light your own candle if you can, so that we can take a moment to appreciate and enjoy the light that the candle represents, and that light that shines within us all. And if you don't have a candle, we have a light that shines so brightly in our eyes that we witness that soul energy shining through. And certainly I witness when I come online with each of you and share all that we do together, that light that you are shines beautifully and brightly as you bring yourselves to our meetings and our times together. So we enjoy and appreciate the light that we are. And as we put our candles down somewhere safe and secure, we move into our opening affirmation that we share together, leading into a quiet time of prayer. So this is based on the invocation written by Charles Fillmore. I am now in the presence of pure being, immersed in the Holy Spirit of life, love, and wisdom. I acknowledge God's presence and power, which, through divine wisdom within me, erases my mortal limitations and brings forth the pure substance of love into our world through us all, according to God's perfect law. So let's take a moment to close our eyes and hold this energy in a moment's silence. And if there is anyone whom we individually hold in prayer, hold in our hearts, let us bring these dear ones to this quiet time and know that they too are one with this beautiful, radiant, healing activity and presence that is God. And so with a felt sense of appreciation, of gratitude, we give thanks for God working in us and through us and filling us and blessing us this moment and always. Amen.
So our affirmation for today is, I am a living expression of God. In the book of Exodus, Moses asked God his name. God responds, I am who I am. I am is the name of the divine presence present within me, a reminder of my spiritual nature. Sometimes I may forget my divine identity by thinking of myself as weak, incapable, or unfortunate. If I have spoken these empowering words about myself, I release those thoughts and stop using those words. Each time I say, I am, I strengthen my awareness of the truth of my being. I am God's life, love, wisdom, and strength, expressing uniquely as me. As I pay attention to my thoughts and words, I am able to recognize and release limiting thoughts more quickly. My awareness of my true identity grows stronger and stronger. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Matthew 16:15. And we may just want to spend a moment really connecting with this statement, I am a living expression of God. I express God's presence uniquely as me. And just stay with that for a moment. Really connect with that presence within, that unique expression of God within.
Thank you, Ildiko. I am a living expression of God. Such a powerful statement to really make our own today. I am a living expression of God. So we take that energy of daily word as we move further into our program. And before we play our next piece of music, I wanted just to welcome Steve, who will be our speaker this afternoon. Most of you know Steve, but not everyone does. Steve works very closely with us at the staff at our Unity UK headquarters for Silent Unity and Daily Word. And I've known Steve, back to 2004, maybe 2005, when you first started coming to the office and working there. We have a delightful relationship. And when Steve said he had something he'd like to share with us, it was like, oh, yes, please, very good. So Steve's title of his talk, The Simple Life, is being introduced by this song, which I have to say I didn't know at all. But he's put it together with a slide to show us the words as these singers, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, sing the song, Teach Your Children.
Who are on the road must have a code that you can live by, and so become yourself, because the past is just a goodbye. Teach your children well, their father's hell did slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams, the one they picked, the one you'll know by. Don't you ever ask them why, if they told you you would cry, so just look at them and sigh. Of tender years, can't know the fears that your elders grew by, and so please help them with your youth. They seek the truth before they can die. Teach your parents well, their children's hell will slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams, the one they picked, the one you know by. Don't you ever ask them why. If they told you, you would cry. So just look at them and sigh, and know they love you.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. And I won't start by explaining that. I hope it will become clear why I chose that tune. It happens to be one of my favorites from a much younger stage in my life. This is the fourth talk that I've ever given over these 20 years. And usually I begin in one of these four talks by saying, I'm not a Unity teacher, I'm not a minister, I'm not any accredited, I haven't done any of the courses. But this time, actually, I'm going to say something different. If I can get through the din from the dog, I'm going to tell you what I am and this kind of links in very much with what I am going to be talking about. When I'm not in Unity, and when I haven't been in Unity, and before I was at Unity, and in fact, after I leave Unity, if I ever do leave Unity, I'm a storyteller. There are two storytellers in Unity. Actually, there's Ruth, who is a child's storyteller. She does a lot of work with children. So she is very talented and very imaginative in telling stories to children. I've told countless stories over my life, not in the same sort of way as Ruth, in many different sorts of ways. And the reason I mention this is that I'm going to be looking at the Gospels today as a storyteller, which is why I say a simple life. It's the Gospels represent a sort of life story, a story of Jesus Christ. And it is, I think, quite a simple life, and that is not an accident. That's not something which is apart from the core of the message. I think it is central to the message. But as a storyteller, I'm not going to be looking at the Gospels, perish the thought, because I'm not an expert on the Gospels or the Bible. I'm not going to be looking at the Gospels in terms of the sort of major events or the ideas or the dogma, if there is dogma, the teachings, but as a story, four stories, because there are four Gospels, of course, four very similar but also quite different stories. I'm not going to be going into that either, but it's useful to remember that there are four different lenses looking at this single story of a human being's life, and depending on your belief, God's life as well, or both God and human being. By the way, the first story I ever told was at the age of 8, and I have a little story to tell about that first story I told. I was in front of the class at my primary school at the age of, I say 8, I'm plucking the age. I think it was 7 or 8, and I used to stand in front of the class. I don't know, maybe every week or something, and tell a story ad lib. And my abiding memory, I was obviously the storyteller of the class, and my abiding memory is that everyone they wanted to be in the story. So I would say, once upon a time, there was a little boy called, and all the hands would shoot up, be me. And so I'd say, Alan, looking at Alan, and he met a little girl on the road, and the little girl's name was, and all the girls would sort of raise their hand. And so that was me telling stories at the age of 8. At about the age of 10, I suddenly got self-conscious, and I never told stories in front of the class again. I suddenly got fearful. And it's quite interesting when I look back on that I was able to tell stories, and then I got fearful, and then I had to tell stories in a different way. When you tell stories, you're interested in several things, several key things. You're interested in characters, who's in the story. You're interested in events, the key events in the story, the climax, and so on and so forth. You're interested, of course, in the themes of the story. And of course, if we were talking about the gospel in a conventional way, we'd be perhaps talking a lot about the themes. You are talking about the plot, the shape of the story, the way the story unfolds. And finally, and this is the area I'm going to be sort of focusing on today, you're also looking at the world, the world that the story unfolds before you. You could say the landscape. What is the image that is there in your mind, the sort of overriding image when you think about a story? And if you're sort of slightly thinking, well, that's not so important as characters and events, just think for a moment of, key stories in our modern world, things like Harry Potter, and you think immediately of those very special landscapes, the Hogwarts school, or the train, or indeed, the fantastical situations that those characters get themselves into. Or if you're thinking of something like The Wizard of Oz, you think of the Yellow Brick Road. If you think of a wonderful romantic adventure, Brief Encounter, which I'm sure many of you will know, you'll think of that train station, which is so important to the plot. But the sounds of the train station, the sound of the trains is so important to that film. Or coming up to date, if you've seen Oppenheimer recently, you, of course, will think of the Nevada desert, the place where the H-bomb was developed, and the landscape in which that incredibly powerful and tragic story unfolds. And you could go on describing stories that have key landscapes. So the Gospels, let's get to the Gospels. What is the landscape? Well, you might seem obvious. But let's sort of think about it for a moment. Is it countryside or is it the city? It's countryside. Almost 90% countryside, and that's important, I think. When I say countryside, of course, it's Palestinian countryside. It's not fields and leafy trees. It's desert or semi-desert countryside. It's outside rather than inside. Almost all the key events in the Gospels occur outside. Interesting, irrelevant, interesting. It's predominantly in domestic spaces rather than in public spaces, in the sense of when it is inside, it's in a room, like the room where the meals are being eaten. It's very occasionally in the temple, but quite occasionally, really. It's not a lot in the temple. Of course, right at the beginning, it's in the stable. And at the end, of course, we have Jesus before Pilate, and we're then in the city, of course, and we're then in a public space. But those are exceptions rather than the rule. The other thing about it, which is also, I think, quite fascinating, is it's changing. It's not one location. If you were thinking of it as a film, you might think of it as a road movie, a bit like Easy Rider or one of the other road movies that you might know. The characters are moving around. Jesus is constantly wandering. He'll go on top of a mountain and give the Beatitudes or whatever, and then he'll go down from the mountain, and then he'll go onto a lake, and then he'll come into a village, and then he'll leave the village. So he's moving. Okay, is that making any kind of significant sense, I wonder? I don't know. Let's continue with these sort of questions about the world. It's outside, it's in the villages and in nature rather than in cities and in towns, apart from key moments. What about Jesus himself? What does he wear? Does he wear a uniform? Does he wear a robe? Does he wear any kind of headdress? Does he wear armor? No. There's not a great deal of description of what he wears, but what we can gather from the odd, we certainly know that he wears sandals without socks. So, he wears very simple footwear. And we can imagine he wears a very simple desert clothes. And if you ever see paintings or films about Jesus, you see him in very ordinary peasant clothes. And who does he talk to when he's with, who is he with? He's with people who are also not wearing uniforms, not wearing headdresses, except, of course, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and we'll return to the Pharisees and the Sadducees a bit later. So he's an ordinary man among ordinary people. He's outside and not inside. He's in domestic spaces. He's not in palaces. And that'd be worth sort of comparing for a moment the Old Testament. Now, there's a lot of the Old Testament, of course, which is also outside, because, of course, we're talking about ancient society, pastoral society, a village world. But actually, if you think about it, the key events, I'm certainly not going to go into any detail in this because I haven't got time and it would be a bit tedious. But if you think about sort of key events in the Old Testament, they often occur in palaces. Or in areas of governance, before kings or chiefs. Not so much in rooms just having meals. One of the greatest films that you probably haven't heard of about the Gospels, because it's quite a sort of esoteric film, but if you ever get a chance to watch it, do watch it, is an Italian film made by a director called Pasolini. It's called The Gospel According to St. Matthew. It was made in 1964. It's possibly, arguably, the best film ever made about the Gospels, and possibly the best film ever made about the spiritual life. So I do recommend it. It was made entirely with non-actors and made entirely with peasants of the time, and made entirely in villages and on mountains, and there are no sets, no studios. Okay, I hope it's kind of something that's beginning to make sense. By the way, this is not about a definitive theory. I'm not in a position to offer any definitive theories, so this is just kind of musings, as Ken Bradley would say. These are just musings, but I hope you're sort of getting a drift in all of this, the simple life. What about the religious bits? Because, of course, we can't completely ignore the religious side, the bits that people say are the religious side. There's lots of teaching, of course, but we're never in a school, and we are sometimes in a temple, but quite rarely. We're never in a meeting house in the sense of a parliament or a tribal meeting place. We tend to be on the road, on a mountain, by a lake, in a room, a private room, not a public room. There are some miracles. If you the simple life without digital effects, shall we say? If you think of the Old Testament, it's full of quite grand supernatural events, and there are some grand supernatural events in the Gospels, of course. Notably at the end, when Jesus dies and the temple is rent and it becomes dark, and actually at the very beginning when they follow the star, and there are odd little moments, the demons and so on. If you think of the miracles, they are very down to earth. Well, most of them are. The marriage of Cana is my favorite in that regard, where he just turns water into wine, and there's no sort of great firework effect. It just happens. But we can think of other things, and of course the healing miracles are, get up from your bed and walk, and they walk. So again, no CGI effects in the Gospels, or hardly any. The other thing about this world, which I think is interesting and significant, and I think this probably has been commented on, a few times before. Well, I'm not the first to talk about these things, obviously, is the lack of violence in the gospel. I remember Kimmery once saying in a talk, I think it was a talk that we listened to actually in the archive recently, where she was saying that when she was young, reading the Old Testament, she was very much put off by all the violence and couldn't get beyond the violence, and it just seemed to make no sense that there was so much violence. Of course, there are so many ways of interpreting the Old Testament, and I'm sure Kimmery would be saying similar things now as well. But that sort of gut reaction we have to the Old Testament. And I certainly, when I open the Old Testament, which I have to say is not very often, I often do get put off by the violence, even though it might be regarded as allegorical. But if you look at the Gospels, there, of course, is the violence of the cross. But if you put that aside, I mean, that's a big thing to put aside, but let's put it aside for a moment. There's very little violence at all. Somebody cuts off somebody else's ear at one point in the Gospels, towards the end. And of course, Jesus protests against that act of violence. And there is the moment when he loses his temper and turns over the stalls in the temple. But he's not a soldier. He's not a political leader. He's not really a Moses. I mean, you need to sort of compare Jesus with the other notable figures in the Old Testament. He, as I've said, he's a simple guy. He's a simple man who walks around, draws other people to walk with him who are very similar to him, talks in very simple places. But he doesn't have a uniform, he doesn't have a horse, he doesn't have a helmet, he doesn't have a sword. That's, it's very, I think these things are really important to think about. Of course, the big moment of violence is the crucifixion, and I think I should sort of just mention this element at this point. The gospel stories are bookended by cities. So I say there's no city discernible or to any extent in the Gospels, in the body of the story. But of course, at the beginning, it's no room at the inn. They come to be counted at a census. So you're aware of the state. City is a kind of slightly, these are, we're talking about a very different type of society, but we get the sense of the state of that time at the beginning, and we get a sense of the state at that time right at the end. And very occasionally, when the Pharisees and the Sadducees appear, we get a sort of inclination of the state. The state will kind of creep over the horizon and enter in a little bit into the story, and of course Jesus will confront them and confound them, and they will retreat again. But of course, at the end of the story, the state triumphs in the obvious sense of the word. The Romans triumph. The Jewish authorities triumph by punishing the rebel and punishing the heretic. And it is the triumph of the city over the countryside, I would argue. Obviously, it's a hollow triumph because we have the resurrection, whether you believe in it as a literal event or whether you see it as a metaphysical truth about human life. It doesn't change the fact that the city is confounded. It can take away Jesus's physical body, but it can't take away his soul. And it's interesting that when Jesus returns, I think this is really interesting, actually. When Jesus returns in all of the Gospels, he doesn't return again in a dramatic way. There's no kind of great CGI moment of, thunder and lightning, and there's Jesus suddenly sort of planted in the middle of the street and everyone is, confounded. He returns as an ordinary, simple human being in a either outside or in a domestic room. We're back in the open spaces. We're away from the city. The ending of the Gospel of John, which is my favorite gospel, when Jesus returns to the disciples on the beach, is, I think, a quite amazing scene. He's just suddenly there with them. Of course, he's suddenly there with them on the road to Emmaus. It's just again, it's not like magic. He's just suddenly one of them, and they go fishing and they catch a lot of. Or they haven't been doing terribly well fishing, and Jesus comes along and they I think is it 153 fish that they managed to catch, and then they eat them. You have these sort of very simple communal activities. Fishing and then eating and teaching, which is part of the communal activity. You eat, you talk, and you listen in the way that we all do as families. And then he literally wanders off over the horizon like Clint Eastwood, you know, the man with no name, you know, off to save another soul somewhere else. So my argument would be that as story archetypes, the Gospels present the power of the simple life, the natural life, the life away from the city, the life without state hierarchy, without state pageantry, state ritual, state the fabric of the state, the clothing of the state. That is where the essential teaching of Jesus exists in the Gospels. At the beginning of the story, the city seems to be in control. The census, no room at the inn. It's interesting that he's born in a stable, you know, in the most natural, you know, amongst nature, the cows, and he's not in a hotel room, you know, not born in a hotel room, not born in a palace, obviously born in a stable. Then his life is there wandering the mountains, the lakes, the rivers, the desert, the villages. And then the town catches up with him. The state catches up with him. The Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Romans catch up with him. And he is destroyed on the cross. I think the cross is interesting. The wood of the cross, you know, the natural wood turned into this unnatural shape, the natural shape of a tree, the sort of development of a trunk of a tree with all its kind of irregularities becomes this kind of symmetrical cross. And so he's put on that symmetrical cross. And for a moment, the state wins, but the state can't win. So why did I choose Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young to begin this talk? Because when I first heard that tune, I was a hippie back in the 60s, trying to live the simple life. And to me, as an individual, as someone now in my mid-70s, amidst climate change, amidst the power of the city, and the dream of a simple life, I cling more and more to the message of those hippie singers, the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the Bob Dylans, the Beatles, but especially the country, because Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young are country, you know, you can hear the country music in there. It's not urban music, it's not rock, it's not Rolling Stones, it's country music. You can hear the country guitar in that tune. This is on the road music. This is living away from the city music. Now, and of course, the hippies get a bad press these days. You know, they were naive. They thought all you have to do was believe in the flower power. They didn't realize that, you know, you can't stop wars by putting flowers into the barrels of the guns of soldiers. You had to do something more serious. And maybe people are right about that. But for a brief period in the 60s and early 70s, the idea of a simple life, as opposed to Vietnam and everything else that was going on then, was an extraordinary gesture of hope, not just on the part of individuals like me, but on the part of people throughout the UK, throughout America, throughout Europe. You know, it was a huge movement. And now, you know, with the Green Movement, with what's happening within Unity, we celebrate, I think, a simpler life. We celebrate a life away from the falsity of the city. I'm not saying all cities are bad, of course. It's just that urban life. It's when it's a lot. I'm going to round off quite soon, by the way, so don't worry. I'm not going to go on too long. Uh, one of the things that I think it's interesting to reflect on is and without going into another huge topic, is the history itself and the rise of the cities. And the way in which cities very quickly became fortress cities. They, the city wall. The wall was very quickly part of city life, and the separation between the city within the wall and then the countryside around the wall. And very often there was a tension between the two. And if you look at medieval societies, you get this tension between the countryside and the city. And even further back, I did some research a number of years ago about Genghis Khan, would you believe? In terms of writing a story, actually, I was trying to write a story about Genghis Khan, God help me. But what I did learn in amongst all of that was that Genghis Khan, for all his evil, was a nomad, and he was part of a huge nomadic part of humanity that existed at that time. There was a real tension between what was called the settled peoples and the nomad people, the restless people and the still people. And you could argue that tension still exists. I mean, today we have the problem of the gypsies and the Irish tinkers. The problem, these are the remnants, the sad remnants of great, noble, nomadic communities who lived by taking their cattle or whatever it was from place to place as the climate and the time of year changed. And they were not attached to things in the way that city people were. Jesus is a nomad in a sense, and his freedom from uniforms, from swords, from hierarchies is partly a reflection of the fact that he never stops being a nomad. He just walks around. He never settles long enough to really become a victim to the stuff of power, except at the end when Rome has its moment. So you could argue that that all this is about two ways of living, that humanity had a fork. There was a fork in the road. One way was to be settled in a town, and the other way was to keep wandering with your cattle from place to place. And we decided, a lot of us, to settle. But as soon as we were settled, we were terrified of what people would do if they found us, and so we built a wall. And then the rest is history. Why is it good to read the Gospels now? Well, to get closer to Spirit, of course, as we all want to do, to connect ourselves with this ancient wisdom and this ancient experience that is so inspiring. But I think it's also to connect with a way of life, a world that offers something very powerful in contradistinction from where we are with all our cities and all our concrete and all our pavements and all our cars and all our skyscrapers. I mean, I am a romantic. I believe in the simple life. And of course it is more complex than that. And I know you can't turn back history and so on and so forth. And maybe Eve or Adam should never have plucked the apple in the first place. Then we'd still be in a nice convivial woodland, wouldn't we? But here we are. But I do think, when we go out and when we go out into the sunshine now and go for a walk, we could perhaps think of Jesus walking through his landscape. And we could think, well, I'm walking here, I'm not wearing a uniform, I'm not in a power relationship with anything, I'm just part of the world. And that's something important. And if I can connect with that, if I can pause and just look at a tree a little bit longer than I would normally do so, then I might just send that little ripple around, which will help us all to stop a little longer in front of a tree and not really want to go back to the next Netflix film, although I watch lots of Netflix. You know, it's never binary, is it? It's always complex. But you get what I mean, and I hope you now understand what I meant at the beginning when I said a simple life. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Steve. I was busy writing notes while you were talking, really. Jesus is the simple man. To me, a loving man, a compassionate man, a wise, inspired man, and walks with us. That's the energy that I always get when I think of Jesus. He walked with us. And so, you know, when we find that simplicity in ourselves and we find the simplicity in life, I think Jesus continues to walk with us, that energy. And we receive it, we get it. So thank you, Steve. Very interesting a talk and sharing ideas from a very different viewpoint, but one really worth thinking about as we, as you say, move into our day and whatever we do following this, taking that energy of simplicity. How can I simplify my life in a way that enables me to know that peace and energy and goodness that Jesus knew? And thank you, Steve.
Tis a gift to be simple, tis a gift to be free, tis a gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in a place just right, it will be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed. Turn will be a delight, till by turning we come round right. 'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, it will be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed. To turn will be a delight, till by turning we come round right.
So let's move into our love offering blessing, a time when we just take a moment to give thanks. To give thanks for all that we experience, the simplicity of life, when we take time just to be still and recognize that. Divine love expressing through me and as me, blesses and multiplies all that I have, all that I give, all that I receive, and my awareness of all that I am. That simple gift of divine love.
That was
So let's close with our prayer for protection together. The light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us. The power of God protects us. The presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is. Amen. So thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. Let me invite you to unmute if you would like to do so. Bless you all. It's been a joy sharing this time with you. Have a delightful afternoon.
You too.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Steve.
you.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Kimberly.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Enjoy the sunshine.